Welcome, everybody. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour, and it is being recorded. We would love to connect with you via social media for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, your reflections, and your observations on social media so that we can all learn together. Once again, the campaign wants to connect with you. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin in just a minute or two. It is being recorded, and we will share it with you afterwards.
It's now the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and say hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Investing in Parents as a Big Bet. My name is Sarah Torian, and I'm a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and I'm helping to manage this weekly series of online learning opportunities. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of really quick housekeeping details. First, I'd encourage you to use the chat box function to introduce yourself. Let us know your name, your organization, and the name of the GLR coalition that you're a part of if you're a member of a GLR coalition. Also, be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you are entering into the chat box so that everyone can see who's in the room with us today. Also wanted to share that all webinar attendees will be participating in listen only during today's webinar, and that's to avoid any background noises or distractions that might occur during our presentations. But we do really encourage your active engagement throughout the webinar and encourage you to share any questions that might come to you during the presentations in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. For those of you who've been joining in our webinars for a long time, you might be used to posing your questions in the chat box. So just want to point out that it is different now. We have a Q&A box, and that makes it easier for us to manage and sort through the questions when we get to Q&A. Also, as you heard just before the webinar started, we will be recording today's conversation, and a link to that recording will be shared with you in a follow-up email that will also include a link to the slide deck and any resources that are shared during today's conversation. So keep an eye out for that. That will come out early next week. Also, just wanted to give a quick heads up that we will be posting a brief what did you think about today's conversation survey poll as we transition into the Q&A portion of the webinar, and really would encourage you to take just a couple of quick moments to share your thoughts and feedback. This helps us in our commitment to continuous improvement. And now I'd like to share just a little bit of background about GLR Learning Tuesdays. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got a number of great sessions planned for the coming weeks, always on Tuesdays and always starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're hoping that this predictable and reliable schedule will make it easier for you and others to make plans to join in for these conversations on a regular basis. We have now hosted 20 webinars since the launch of GLR Learning Tuesdays last September. So I would also encourage you to check out CLIP. That's the campaign's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, where you can find links to the recordings, slide decks, and other resources. It's a really amazing growing archive of resources exploring the best science, ideas, and programs to inform our work to ensure early school success for more children in low-income families. And then I hope you'll continue to save this date and time and make plans to join in for more of these online learning conversations. Now for today's conversation about investing in parents as a big bet. I think we all know that research affirms the importance of elevating parent success, successful parenting, and productive partnerships with parents. And many program partners recognize that and are placing parents at the center of the work that they are doing. But much more is needed. And so today's presentation will help us understand what we can do to increase philanthropic investment that focuses on parents as essential co-producers of good outcomes for children. And so to begin that conversation, I'm very honored to introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator today is Steve Hammond. Steve is the president of LENA, a national nonprofit focused on increasing adult-child talk in order to improve child outcomes. Steve is privileged to lead a talented team in the shaping and scaling of the organization's caregiver-directed initiatives that integrate LENA's talk pedometer technology. Steve leverages a wealth of technical and leadership skills honed over a 25-year career spanning multiple industries. He's been instrumental in transitioning LENA from an organization known solely for its research on early language to one known for putting research into action and positively impacting children and families around the world. So Steve will be moderating a conversation today with our two panelists, William Foster and Sridhar Prasad, both partners at the Bridgespan Group. If we could go to the next slide, please. William is the head of the U.S. Advisory Services at Bridgespan and is an active thought leader on philanthropy and social change. Since joining the firm in 2002, William has supported the success of some of the sector's most innovative philanthropies and some of the highest impact nonprofits. He has a particular focus on the diligence, structuring, and supports required for philanthropic big bets. William has helped his foundation clients and a number of individual donors to craft some of the sector's largest gifts. Based on his clients' experiences, William has dedicated himself to research on the topics of philanthropic big bets and nonprofit funding models. Most recently, Becoming Big Bettable was published by Stanford Social Innovation Review in February of 2019. Previously, William served as executive director of the Jacobson Family Foundation, now known as 1-8, an outcome-oriented funder making grants to support educational excellence, equality, and Jewish continuity in the United States and Israel. Prior to joining Bridgespan, William worked at Bain & Company, and he graduated from Harvard College and Stanford Graduate School of Business. He will be joined in the presentation by Sridhar Prasad. Sridhar is a partner in Bridgespan's Boston office. As part of Bridgespan's philanthropy and global development practice areas, Sridhar has worked with a number of nonprofits, impact investors, foundations, and philanthropic collaboratives, including the Center for Policing Equity, the Inter-American Development Bank, Gates Foundation, ABC World Asia, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Audacious Project. Much of his work has focused on building successful platforms to harness and direct philanthropic capital in order to both reduce perceived barriers for aspirational philanthropists and to increase scale capital for high-impact change agents. He's also a leader in Bridgespan's own work to advance racial equity and inclusion in the organization. Sridhar has co-authored several articles on high-impact philanthropy and big bets and has presented on how organizations can become Big Bettable at the School World Forum and the Schwab Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Summit. Sridhar holds a BA in History from Columbia University, a JD from the Harvard Law School, and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. So thank you, Steve, William, and Sridhar for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this critical topic. Now I'll pass it over to Steve, who will guide us through the conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be with you today and be joined by William and Sridhar. Good afternoon. Today's topic, investing in parents as a big bet, is particularly timely given the convergence of social science and brain science over the recent decade plus. And I will say that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading is hosting this is apropos because CGLR has been at the forefront of championing parents for many years. I believe Ralph Smith likely coined the phrase that parents are the secret sauce to making a difference. And that actually happens to be one of the three truths we live by here at LENA. As Sarah noted, we're a national nonprofit social entrepreneurial organization, and we focus on increasing adult-child talk to boost child outcomes. And our talk pedometer technology is the global standard for measuring talk in early childhood. Small LENA devices are worn by children to capture and automatically quantify their language environment, and it's both an amazing tool for researchers and a central piece of programs we've been implementing now around the country and in the world with community partners. We exist as an organization actually because of a big bet. that was initiated here 15 years ago. That earliest big bet was pretty unique, and what we're going to learn today is probably a more standard way that big bets are being placed. But this was unique because the philanthropists and the social entrepreneurs were one and the same, Terry and Judy Paul. And through the Paul's family's big bet and our mission to support parents, they assembled an amazing team that developed the Lena technology, validated it, drove its adoption throughout the early language research community, and then it established it as a research and evidence-based foundation from which we then have transitioned to an organization putting research into practice in partnership with community-based organizations around the world. We reached more than 10,000 children last year, and now we're engaging with strategic funders to consider the next big bet ourselves as we dramatically scale our impact tenfold and more. So today's webinar is certainly relevant to me. And like many social entrepreneurs and innovators out there today in the audience, we often struggle, I think, to hone and simplify a compelling investment concept. You know, do we spend enough or too much time defining the problem? And is that clear? Do we toss around these aspirational goals? And today certainly is one of those. We want to move the needle to improve child outcomes, for example. That connotes this sense of a comprehensiveness that we may need, may be hard pressed to satisfy in practice. And then we're asking our philanthropic support to contribute. Are we doing that to contribute to incremental growth or impact that is going to be catalyzing at scale and sustainability? So, what's the role of philanthropy? So these are questions. And then from a funder perspective, how are they looking at big bets? There's a lot to learn there. What's their rubric in practice, and what should it be to be most effective and impactful? And these are the types of questions that I think our fabulous panelists, William and Sridhar, will be addressing today. So it's Tuesday, let's learn. And I'm going to turn it over to Sridhar and William to share their work around big bets.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having us. We're delighted to be able to share some of our research and to have a conversation about how some of this research can be applied to what CGLR does, specifically around the big bet on parents. Bridgespend itself has been around for about 20 years, and for the vast bulk of that time, we've been concerned, I'd say, with two primary issues. The first is, how do nonprofits have more impact? How do they accelerate their impact? But the second, and equally as important if we think about driving social change, is how do we think about philanthropic capital flows, and how do we both ensure those capital flows are as effective as possible, but that, frankly, more of those philanthropic flows happen specifically to social change. And so a few years ago, William and a number of our colleagues led research around this concept of big bets. What kinds of large philanthropic commitments happen in the field of social change? And we'll get to definitions in a moment. The first question I should say is, why big bets? Well, if you think about the effect of a large philanthropic contribution on an organization, it gives organizations the time, the space, and the ability to start thinking more creatively, more expansively about the work that they do, and to shifting from to a world where they can actually start thinking about solving the underlying problems that they're working on. That in fact, that we can make a bigger dent in the significant problems that I would imagine all of us on the phone care about with these larger kinds of philanthropic contributions that can accelerate progress. So with that, let's talk about a little bit of the research. I mentioned this concept of social change. So when we did the research, we defined social change as expansively as possible, but effectively it is all of the philanthropic contributions that go towards solving the world's most difficult moral and economic challenges: education, climate, healthcare, conservation, homelessness, poverty. The health of our democracy. Saying nothing about that today. The challenges that, in many ways, and the counterpoint to those kinds of giving would be gifts to often to arts and culture, to higher education, to large health systems, all crucially important, and there's no pejorative nature on those at all. But those gifts, in some ways, if we think about, well, why did we think about social change? Well, let's take a step back to what is it that philanthropists actually care about? The team that did the research looked deeply at things like the Giving Pledge letters and interviews with philanthropists to figure out, well, what exactly did these philanthropists, do donors actually care about? And if you ask donors the question, what do you want to be remembered for? Social change priorities, things like ending malaria, as referenced through the graph, end up being one of the top 3 priorities for 80% of philanthropists.
And the exclusive priority for 60%.
And so one would expect that if that's the case, that 60% or 80% of the dollars would then go towards those kinds of priorities. But in truth, in looking at all of the big bets that we could identify through all of the databases available, only about 20% of big bet dollars went to what you'd call social change. The balance went to other kinds of gifts and other kinds of recipients. So that then begged the question of why? What's going on? Why is there such an aspiration gap? Our research discovered 6 kinds of challenges, and we bucket them in two buckets. One around mindsets. Specifically, what is preventing a philanthropist from even entertaining a big bet in social change? Well, the first is that many philanthropists or would-be philanthropists don't feel that time is right. They want to wait. That delay is often the single biggest competitor to giving to social change. The second would be the perception of heavy public risk versus the perceived public reward for giving to social change causes. These are messier causes. They're more difficult. They're certainly more difficult to find solutions for. And the examples often in popular press are of when gifts to social change go badly than the reverse. The third is that there's an underinvestment in finding and securing these kinds of deals. This is a good transition in some ways to the deal-making challenges bit, but that folks who are looking for social change gifts often do not have the same kind of social capital, do not have the same kind of access to philanthropists as universities, health systems, other kinds of educational institutions, other kinds of places where philanthropic dollars often go. William has told the story before in public of clients or philanthropists that he's known who have spent an inordinate amount of time structuring gifts in a social change context. I think it was over a year thinking through a specific, very large gift for that field in a specific geographic area. And a corresponding gift that was, I think, 2x the size to that philanthropist's alma mater was given without necessarily the same kind of diligence, without the same kind of preparation, if you would. But instead, it was made based on a reliance on personal relationships, based on a reliance on the emotional appeal of your alma mater. That transitions into the deal-making challenges that we've also often seen. I've talked about the social capital piece around relationships. The second is that, and this is the context for the rest of our discussion, very few social change gifts are often structured and ready for, quote, a big bet. And we'll get to what that means, but at a high level, do we as a sector often describe what the point of arrival can be for a given gift, what it would be used for, what the credible path is to get there, and therefore why this gift of all gifts would be most compelling and is most needed at this particular point in time. That challenge in many ways, the world of universities, in part because of the astounding resources they have to be able to dedicate towards fundraising, those pitches are framed in such a way. And so that as a competitive dynamic becomes challenging. Lastly, the difficulties of measuring social change. Again, the problems of the commons, the problems around things like malaria and climate and education are more difficult to measure. They are more difficult to often see progress on. And that makes a deal, unfortunately, more difficult. So those are the challenges. I think we want to spend the bulk of our time then thinking through, well, how do you break through some of those challenges? The last point I'd say before passing the baton to my colleague is that when we think about potential big bettors, the audience for a big bettable prospectus is frequently not a new donor of some kind, but it's often the donors that you already have. So as a general pattern, we see that the big bet an organization often receives is preceded by 4 smaller gifts that go from that very donor to that organization. So in truth, you would think about your existing donor list and say, well, who of that donor list has the potential to give at a much greater amount? And for whom can this cause be not just their top 50 cause, but can it move to become their top 5 cause? I think this would be the next graphic on the size of it as well. The other point to make on that is that the size of the big bet is often a significant multiple to what gifts they've given before. It's often up to a 10x multiple of a previous gift.
You know, one of the funny things when we have conversations, at Bridgespan, we have the good fortune to work with hundreds of social entrepreneurs each year, as well as a number of philanthropists. And a common question is, can you introduce us to Bill Gates? Can you introduce us to, a billionaire of some type? First of all, we can't. But secondly, there's a sense that, for those of us that are so deeply passionate about certain issue areas, that have dedicated our lives to working on better parenting or any of the other kinds of issues that Sridhar talked about, that if we could just meet the right person and talk to them and have them see the problem through our own eyes, through the way we focus on it, that surely that would unleash resources, right? We know there are people out there that have enormous resources and that at least nominally want to give it away. And what we found though is that big bets don't come from new donors. I mean, I think Sridhar mentioned the research we had done. We built a database where we looked at every identifiable $10 million gift made by a US-based donor over a 14-year period of time. At the $20+ million level, it's really quite thorough. At the 10 million, we don't catch everything, but a fair amount. And then we took a sampling to look back and said, what's the origin story of all of these gifts? And the data that Sridhar went through shows that on average, I mean, this is a statistical thing, that on average, they were the fifth gift. There were about 15% that were a first-time gift, but only 15%. And so, the story of the big gift is not a sort of changing someone's mind. It's not a magical dinner, and it's not a, introducing someone to an issue, right? The story is someone already cares about the issue. Someone already likes the nonprofit. They already believe in the leadership. But what they see is enormously better. It's enormously better than what they've seen before. So, in some sense, the issue and the people and the personal connections are the necessary ingredients to get in the conversation. But what it takes to move from a supporter to a big bet supporter is something different.
That's great. And I think you might put a shout out, I guess, to the recent report that came out of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, where you actually have some of those gifts sort of outlined. I think there was a question that came in about, where are these big bets being made right now in terms of what part of the sectors? And I don't know, this was a question that came in. I'm wondering whether you might comment on where do you see a lot of these bets that in your data where you've mined, where do you see, are they kind of scattered all over, or where do you see the hot spots are for where big bets are being made right now, William or Sridhar?
I'd say that there's a set of areas that are pretty consistent, that historically things around education is a concern. And I think about it almost from what do philanthropists talk about when they say they want to make an impact in a meaningful way. We've heard education almost historically, almost always is one of the top priorities. Global health is often a top priority. The climate is often, and environmental issues is often a top priority. And then I think you get a set of priorities that rotate based on the climate or based on the circumstances that happen. So 5 or 6 years ago, I think there were a number of philanthropists who started asking deeply about refugees and the refugee crisis. A couple of years ago, a number of philanthropists started saying, how do we think about civic engagement and democracy and the state of where that's going? And so so that, I think that there's a variable component to it, but there's a set of places that I think are a set of topics that are not oldies but goodies is the wrong way to say it, but almost consistent priorities for philanthropy.
Great. So appetite is whetted. So we know what these big bets are, and it's sort of what I think a lot of the learning for folks here in this social sector, they're looking to make parents a big bet or any other related things within the early childhood sector a big bet. What do we need to pay attention to? How do we be more effective? It isn't, unfortunately, we've just learned that it's not just one magical dinner. So I think there's probably more to it. And so maybe William, share a little bit about what you've learned and what you might recommend for us aspiring grantees for a big bet need to know.
We're happy to, Steve. So we've identified 5 elements that are outlined here that are the critical elements for a big bet. And and none of these 5 elements are going to strike folks as shocking, right? But when we have worked, at Bridgespan, as I said, we work the majority of our time is with social entrepreneurs, with nonprofit actors, but also with donors, and we have a sample size of multiple hundred funded deals. Whether it's we've helped a donor find someone to fund, or we've worked with a nonprofit and their donor set on kind of the next stage of their strategy, and we see these 5 elements pretty consistently. You also see them just in the listing of the big bets, and they're outlined here. 1, the problem has to be important or matter. And to Sridhar's earlier comments, for sure, there's some times where certain problems resonate more than others, right? Based on world events, based on events in a country or community. So the problem has to resonate. I'll then go to the 5th and talk about that one before getting to the middle 3. The 5th element is that the team and leader of the organization have to be compelling. People have to see them as folks who actually can make change, people that are inspiring, that want to be connected. And the bad and good news on these 2 elements well, I'll start with the good news. I mean, the good news is that we're blessed as a sector to have many incredible leaders, charismatic leaders, results-oriented leaders, driven leaders, often embodied in a single person that truly inspire donors, inspire their communities, inspire the world. We're blessed to have very strong teams, and we're blessed to have innovators, right? The number of nonprofit organizations and campaigns and initiatives that are truly taking a distinctive and new approach on problems is remarkable. So that element is frequently present. The bad news on the first element is that it too is often frequently present. So meaning, we live in a world that is rich in problems, right? That there are many topics that any one of us could dedicate our lives to addressing and have those be lives well worth having lived, right? There are many topics that a donor could dedicate the wealth of their career to addressing and have that be well deployed. And so both of these are present. And the reason that that's actually important is that those are necessary ingredients, but in some sense, generally not the distinctive ones, right? That when we work with nonprofit organizations and when we see nonprofit organizations, I would estimate that 80% of the time and the materials are focused on these 2 things. Think about topics outside the world of parents, but think about climate change. The amount of time that a nonprofit or an activist group working on it talks about the consequences of a rise in global temperature and to driving that home is profound. The number of times that an educational organization talks about how their team and approach is unique and different are large. It's these 2 elements that are typically the heart of what we discuss. And what they leave out are, of course, these middle 3 ingredients. We focus dominantly on the problem and our team or on our approach, but not as much on these middle 3. So let me just focus us on these middle 3 then, because that's a little bit jargony. But these are the things that we see as vital and less frequently present. So the first is a point of arrival, a term that Sridhar used earlier. And what we mean by that is what will actually be reached or achieved in the with philanthropic funding. Think of it almost as chapters of a book, right? It's not necessarily reaching, if you're committed to improving parenting or the parent-child relationship towards the goal of changing outcomes of a child, one could imagine that that's a generation or multi-generation project, one that won't be achieved in a 5 or 7 year, 3-year time frame. But what is the thing that can be achieved? And again, with the chapters of a book analogy, there may be a whole book that needs to be written, but the next chapter is something we can see. Where do we get to in the next chapter of our strategy, in the next chapter of our work, in the next chapter of our funding? And it should be a goal that's big enough to matter, but yet one that's modest enough to actually be achieved. Frequently that means narrowing, right? If we go back to the issue of climate change, there are very few nonprofit actors that can credibly, or there are no nonprofit actors, I think, that can credibly say their actions and activities will change the trajectory of our planet's temperature. But there are all kinds of critical components to getting to that goal, which can be influenced by an actor or a small group of actors, whether that's in the realm of scientific discovery or in public policy achievements in a certain geography or in education and support. And so what is the component that can be achieved? And I'll give you an illustration from organizations that we've worked with in the past, which was, there's a client that in the child welfare space called Youth Villages out of Memphis. And some of you on the call may know them. They do very good work helping families and children stay together that are at risk of being in state custody and having the trajectory of a child's life thrive. I mean, it is about parenting to a large degree. And they have a successful program model. But one of the barriers that they found was that in every community, there are phenomenal and beloved organizations doing similar kinds of work. And the program model, and even if it has better results, isn't a differentiating factor that will lead a local government to contract with some group from another city. And they decided that for the long-term trajectory of their impact, they needed to start offering licensing and training programs. And that in fact, if they could switch their model from being a direct service provider dominantly to being one that works with local community groups on the insights and tools that they have, that it could open up a whole new realm. And they attracted significant philanthropic funding to make that pivot. That was not solving all the problems of children at risk of being in state custody in the United States, but it was a very significant chapter that donors said, wow, if you could do that, it would be a new state of play. The second element that we have here is a credible pathway. Is there a goal that while worthy of being achieved is just simply a leap of faith, right? Or does it actually seem like there's a predictable set of steps that, again, may be hard, but are doable and one could get there? I think about one of the examples outside the world of direct service, but very relevant to recent US history, which is marriage equality, the establishment of gay marriage as a basic civil right and norm. If that debate, like many public policy debates, had been framed as a sort of singular battle in the Supreme Court or in the halls of Congress, there might not have really been a credible pathway to get there. There's so many opposing forces and different forces of unpredictable power and dynamics. How would you know that even great work could move the needle on an issue? But in the case of, as some of you may be familiar with it, in the case of this public policy campaign, it was focused on state level actions, right? Where there's 50 states in the United States, each has a legislature and a judiciary, which creates 100 possible pathways. And at the time that campaign began, the vast majority of them were not amenable to a change in the marriage laws. But there was a subset that were, and they adopted a strategy of sort of going after the earliest wins to build momentum for the next category of wins. And what otherwise could be just this big amorphous question with all kinds of players at stake became a very manageable pathway where there were winnable milestones and one could know 10% of the way through, 20% of the way through, 30% of the way through if progress was being made. And then the final element worth touching on is why philanthropy, right? Philanthropy is a small part of the stew of ingredients going into the world of social change. And in many fields of endeavor, irrelevant, right? There's work being funded, both in terms of innovation and execution by the government. There's all kinds of places where the contributions, $100 contributions from average citizens drives the difference. There's many fields of endeavor that don't rely on philanthropy. So what is it, if there's a point of arrival, if there's a goal, if there's a pathway to get there, why is philanthropy such a critical missing ingredient? Is it just a 1% add-on to the 99% that other folks are doing? Or does it serve some purpose? Is it growth capital or innovation capital, where it's a one-time expenditure that gets a group to a different place? Is it an ongoing investment that just fills a particular niche that can't be filled otherwise, that improves outcomes? So what is the role of philanthropy? And I guess what I would say on this to sort of describe it in a slightly different fashion is that most nonprofits actually have at the heart of their strategy a single story or a single theory, if you will. I don't know if any of you on the webinar, studied literature in college or in high school, but there's all kinds of writers that will say that there's only 7 stories or 9 stories and 12 stories in literature. The sort of hero's quest, man versus nature, man versus society, or person versus society or nature. But in a lot of ways, most nonprofit stories, which focus on the first and fifth elements here, are essentially saying, here's a problem that's of monumental importance, probably more importance than the donor appreciates. And here is a team that is doing incredible work in a way that is differentially better than what other folks are doing. And we would like your philanthropy to allow us to do more of that great work. And in essence, that's the strategy. It's both the communications and the strategy. And what we see is that, in fact, there are actually different stories that exist in the world of the most successful nonprofits. There's stories of establishing vital infrastructure that is absent from the world today. There are stories about catalyzing fields to behave in different ways. There are stories about investing in growth that can then be sustained from other sources. That there's ways in which, instead of saying to a philanthropist, give us a certain amount of money, and we would then like to come back and ask for more money, and it's drops in a bucket that each on their own doesn't seem to be significant, to places where actually that it makes a huge difference. And it's not a communications problem, right? It's actually not about finding a better way to articulate. It's actually a strategic problem, right? If what we're talking about in some sense on the surface level here is what motivates a donor to give more money to important causes, what we're talking about at the most fundamental level is actually what all of us on this phone do with our lives, right? If we're here to move the needle on a critical social issue, the very 5 elements that are here are actually the same 5 elements that we should be thinking about for what it takes to actually create enduring change of a meaningful scale. And what we have found, which I think is invigorating and positive, is that the key to getting that 10x step up in the bubble chart that my colleague Sridhar showed earlier is not, whining and dining. It's not a sort of whiz-bang presentation. It's actually about answering these 5 elements in a way where a donor can say, gosh, there are many causes that matter to me and to the world, and there are many impressive leaders, but this is one of those few times I've seen an approach that can create an enduring, meaningful difference. And that very hurdle is the one that should motivate us for what we invest our lives in doing. So with that, Steve, let me pause and open it up for questions.
Sure, I think that's fabulous, and I think your last several points there that were really profound relative to what we're asking philanthropy to do I'll begin there because there's a couple questions I have in my own queue to ask. And one is just an observation to put a point on your last point. If you look at the early Head Start or Head Start funding, in 1 year, it's the equivalent of what philanthropy has put in the same early childhood space over a decade. So you have to really be mindful about, what are you asking philanthropy to do? What is the catalyzing action there? I think that's really that's a tough aspect of that. So, and I think that's, I think we probably see that in some other places as well, but I just want to sort of amplify that. I was just at the Winter Leadership Institute, and that was something that the Head Start community talked about. And so how does philanthropy play a vital role there, and what are we asking them to do? One question though, that just to begin, I think this whole idea about how, from a funder perspective, maybe begin there almost, there are a set of behaviors that you guys have observed in your work, and you're recommending, I think, different behaviors than maybe differ markedly, as Sridhar and you as well, Williams, cited, than what conventional philanthropy has done. And so I'd begin a little bit, what are the other things you're doing? And this is a question from Ralph Smith. So since he called me just before the webinar, I think I put that first. That probably is wise for me. But what, you're asking for like a mindset shift and a disruption there because of all the downside risk that exists in this type of an approach. It is not all upside, and it's actually very visible. People are pretty aware of these things when a bet's made as to how it goes. So what are some of the things you're doing on the funder side of things to help disrupt on that side?
I can start, and then William can please build on this. But I think the first thing to note is, how do we increase the awareness of and celebration of big bets made and recognition of big bets made, while also recognizing that social change is hard. I take the incredibly controversial big bet that Mark Zuckerberg made a few years ago to the New York public schools of the $100 million gift that he made on Oprah, with not necessarily a ton of work done prior to it. It was Dale Russakoff with the book that basically said all the reasons why this was a bad idea. And truth be told, the bet was probably not the optimal use of $100 million. It probably did some good, in net. But it also probably... And
there's actually data to support that.
But I'd argue a flip side, which is, if you have someone who is going to, over the course of their lifetime, give away billions to social change, and has said that they want to give away billions to social change, the learning opportunities that come from a bet that is that had all of the complications that the Newark gift had are just as valuable if you think about the lessons that will then apply to the rest of his corpus as something that was wildly successful. How much do we as a sector, how much do we through publications or through whatnot talk about the fact that, one, social change is hard, two, that philanthropists should learn as they go through it, which means you should start early and do often in order to learn as much as possible. And three, how do we celebrate those gifts that are made? So we've, over the last 4 or 5 years with Forbes, highlighted the biggest bets that were the biggest gifts of social change that have been made. I think we've worked with philanthropists to try to dismantle this notion that because it's hard, therefore you should delay. That instead, the reverse is true, that because it is hard, you must start early and get started in order to maximize that learning and get better and better and better over time. And I think we're trying to create various platforms or multi-donor giving platforms or donor collaboratives that seem to reduce perceived risk in some ways, increase the ways in which donors can engage with ideas, in order to, again, to increase flow.
So all of those are things we're doing. It's worth noting we're a nonprofit ourselves. We're a 501c3, and we have a mission about supporting social change leaders to achieve breakthrough results on society's toughest problems. One of the ways we see doing that is increasing the flow of philanthropy. So we want through our direct work, through our research and publications, through some of the kinds of infrastructure that Sridhar described, we want to increase the amount of money flowing to philanthropy. We want to increase the proportion of that that's going to social change. And we want to increase the proportion of the social change money that's funding leaders that are proximate to the causes that they're working on. So we want to do all three of those things. It's hard work. And just as an example, you know, on average, folks who have signed the Giving Pledge are worth twice as much as when they signed the Giving Pledge. So, you know, they are giving away enormous amounts of money, and the stock market's been amazing in terms of its returns the last few years. So there's some sort of abnormal dynamics of the past few years. But the deeper point is they're not giving away money fast enough to achieve their own pledged intention. So we are working on that. And I would also say, which we'll get into presumably more in this conversation, we also think it requires changes on behalf, on the part of social change leaders, on the nonprofit leaders. And part of it is actually doing something, you know, being willing to think at an ambitious enough level to really attract and to strategically justify large amounts of money, but also to be realistic enough about it that it's not just, you know, give us more to do more. It's like taking seriously what enduring change, what it takes to achieve enduring change, and putting it together.
That's a great point. I think, yeah, it's obviously we have two sides of this, and I think this sort of outreach and gaining visibility to this is an important piece of work you're doing. And you guys have been at it for a little while. I was looking back at your 2015 TED Talk, which I recommend actually for everyone out there as a wonderful companion to today's webinar. William had that. And I think you predicted, so I'm going to see how much of a Nostradamus clairvoyant you are. How did we do over the last 5 years? And you've learned more along the way, but, you know, have there been more big bets over that time? Have they changed in some dramatic way or any way? And what do you forecast for the next sort of 5 years ahead as to where do you see things, you know, do you see traction being made here on this, I think, way to shape the dialogue to be more effective, I guess, between philanthropists and social change agents?
So I have two answers for you. You know, the first answer, which is a cop-out, is we don't actually know the data of what has happened in, say, 2019 or 2020 versus 2015, because the amount of work it actually takes to build that database is enormous. So we will do that once the 2020 or 2019 data are available. But I would say on an anecdotal basis, we're seeing enormous momentum. The number, and the place where we see it most is that the number of donors giving multiple large-scale bets is enormous. I mean, some of them attract national attention, like Robert Smith, who gave, which HBCU was it? It was to Howard.
Morehouse.
So it was Morehouse. Excuse me, it's Morehouse. You know, Robert Smith, in our last tracking, has now given multiple big bets each year. Blue Meridian has given multiple big bets each year. Just the number of donors giving, in our ongoing annual basis, we look at $25 million gifts. Giving multiple $25 million gifts is growing. So we have to think that the underlying data are going to be positive.
Great. And then one more, and then I'll ask this one, and then we'll start teeing it up to some questions from you in the audience as well. But one of the things in the sort of the middle three elements, which are really critical, especially you know, we think about the mitigation of risks, and when you're ready, you had the four, as you say, the data shows that there's these four smaller bets, and there's certainly in the information you shared that there's some hypotheses that are tested and so forth. But you know, there's few what I call, I guess, point solutions in practice. And that is we've developed a solution, it's static in time, and let's go scale it. And I think you talked about this, I think in your previous remarks, as being kind of shovel ready. You know, who can absorb this? So you have, you know, if someone was to make a big bet, how do you spend that money wisely? And then, you know, in the course of that, when is this sort of, I talk about it being like this testing hypotheses along the way. And we have, there are certain funders out there that really love that, this learn and adapt type of model. And in this three central elements of your model for framing, you know, what are you finding in practice out there in terms of the big bet funder openness to, yeah, I have these risks that I'm going to retire them, I know them, but there's all the unknowns I have as I go along. So how do you think funders are looking at that from a kind of a journey with the grantee, if you will, as they go and find these things out, and the transparency that's required there to share, oh my God, this isn't working and we need to adjust. What are you learning there?
Yeah, you use the word transparency. I think that to us that would be the center of it, which is that this is hard work, and to assume that there is a blueprint or a specific manual that just with the infusion of capital and capital alone will result in the changes that we require within society. I don't think donors even believe that. I don't think that would be a realistic or credible path for that matter. By the time you're having the conversation with a donor around a big bet investment concept, they're probably already bought into the problem for a couple of reasons. One, they've already given you money up to this point.
Right.
If you take the point of this is the fifth bet, the big bet's the fifth bet that they'll get. And two is that they likely strongly both agree with the problem and the team. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had that maintained connection with the organization at all. So in many ways, you're asking the donor to go on a journey with you. And you're trying to sell them effectively on, this is the place that your capital can help us get to, the point of arrival. This is the way I think this will happen. And I think within that, within the notion of the credible path, I think is saying, these are the ways in which this may emerge. And then noting the ways in which their philanthropy is particularly distinctive along that pathway. William's reference of the marriage equality movement, I think is telling, because they had spent a fair amount of time writing out a blueprint up front, but that blueprint had 1,000 myriad risks of ways in which the world could change. It was a best guess at saying, here's the next 5 things that we think we need to do to move the ball forward along a 15-year journey that will lead us to, or 10-year journey that will lead us to equality. But that transparency and building in that transparency as part of that credible path feels like the approach that you want to take.
Great. We have that's another question from Ralph. He wonders, and I think it's a great point, is there a difference between big grants and big bets in the way you guys look at it, in terms of analysis and the way we should be thinking about it? Big bets may have a different endpoint or vision, and are we, the conflation of those two, and in terms of how we analyze this?
Yeah, and I'll try and address that. I think in our language we are conflating them, and for the sake of simplicity. But let me draw the difference. For the purposes of research, we had to define certain grant types. So all of the facts that we've given are based on gifts of $10 million or more, and we simply need to do it. The truth is that the Gates Foundation is heavily represented in that, and for the Gates Foundation, $10 million may not be such a big bet, right? So there's flaws there, but by and large, we think it drives to an important set of analytical insights that hold true. When it comes to the actual behaviors around big bets, we do think about it in a more subtle way, and what we think about is a gift that is meaningful for the donor, meaning this isn't one of a myriad of things.
Right.
It's a significant gift for the donor. And it's also a significant gift for the recipient. This isn't the 100th largest gift the recipient is getting. And that if it's significant for both, then the dynamics we've described about what's necessary comes to pass. So there's nothing magical in our research definition of 10 million. $9 million would be pretty big too. And if $2 million is the biggest gift someone's ever given, that's really big too. And I think that, one of the places to draw out the data that I think then becomes more widely applicable than just these numbers that we had to take a cut at one way or another, is that same data slide that Sridhar shared of the 4 bets leading to this 5th bet that was 10 times the size actually also represented on average going from that 4th gift from being the 50th largest donation in a philanthropist portfolio of gifts to being the 5th largest donation. And so if you just think about mine, it doesn't matter whether it's 10 million or 1 million or 100 million or maybe even 500,000, but if a donor had you as one of their top 50, they've got to believe in the cause and believe in you. But to be top 5, they really have to believe that this is going to be one of the kinds of things that leaves an enduring legacy from their work.
Yes, great. That's good. Good to keep in mind, and I think you had no choice. I mean, determining that, because you look on the table and was the Gates Foundation, and they have, or Bloomberg's big bets, as you had from the Bloomberg Philanthropies. Some of those are pretty substantial. They also make some other ones that are fairly hefty elsewhere. So I think it's helpful to have that perspective. A question from the audience. We're talking about the parent side of things, and I think this is probably common across other types things of the sector, is sort of, the enduring impact, and when will you know? We're dealing with early childhood, and so this comes to this whole idea about how long it takes you to see some of these outcomes a decade or so later. And you mentioned this earlier, so this may be just putting a amplification on some of the points you made. But related to the specific achievable goal, when we focus on targeted outcomes on parents, for example, we get pushback from some funders and others who want our programs to demonstrate child outcomes. It's frustrating because, as you say, it takes years to prove. So we have these near-term outcomes, and we rely on, we have this sort of argument, that logic argument, and face validity is in our favor for this investment, and people really worry about the fade-out effects and all of that. But what is the advice you might have to those folks that are trying to handle this dilemma in their framing of what they're doing and how they're articulating it to those that are doing these small lead-in bets, and to be able to figure out how to really take the next leap ahead?
All right, I'll take a crack at it. I'll make 2 points, and 2 points on this. One is that that we purposely didn't have under our point of arrival here as advice evidence of impact. And there's a range of interest level different donors have on this, particularly, by the way, in a number of institutional foundations. There's a higher level of interest in this. And there may be some donors where that's a, known evidence on child level outcomes is just what they ask for, and frankly, there's nothing to do about that. That's, their policy. But certainly our sense is that for the majority of donors, and the vast majority of individual donors, those hurdles aren't inherently there. And some of those questions may actually just simply be proxies for a more fundamental question, which is like, how do I know this is going to amount to anything?
Yeah.
Right. And almost everyone has that question on their mind when they think about a gift that's really significant to them. Like, how do I know there's going to be change versus fighting the good fight, right? Love fighting the good fight, but how do I know it's going to leave some lasting change? And that's a question that I think, there are many steps to that answer. I mean, I think as an example, when the Sandlers supported the creation of ProPublica, right, which is the sort of media nonprofit that does really high quality journalism. There aren't known outcomes on the quality of American journalism, but the logic of saying the number of journalist positions at large reputable newspapers is plummeting, and the economic model is failing for newspapers. Therefore, we believe it's vital to society to have a certain number of high quality journalists backed in a different economic model. That was an arrival point based in logic. You knew what you were getting. It made sense. And I guess the final thing I'll just add on that before we jump to another question is among the things we've talked here, our experience is that this is more true for ultra high net worth individuals than it is for institutional foundations, for 2 reasons. One is that institutional foundations, you frequently have very expert staff that are deeply invested in particular approaches. And typically institutional foundations spend the entirety of their budget each year. Therefore, any tripling or quintupling or whatever the word for 10 timesing is of gift 1 has to come out of somebody else's pocket, right? I mean, it's like it's splitting the pie. Whereas for ultra high net worth individuals, typically they're not giving the full potential of what they could or what they want to. Therefore, it's not about splitting the pie, it's about growing the pie.
Well, that's a great observation. It ties to one of the questions I had thought about, and it teed up a little bit earlier, is this, and maybe it's a question of whether it's institutional versus high net worth. There's sometimes a perception that big bets can kind of consume most of the oxygen and funding, so it can be exclusionary to new ideas. So I see it definitely from an institutional perspective where they just made this heftier bet, this bigger bet. So they're kind of, that's consuming them so they're off the table. And in this community, if they make a big bet in the community, you can't find any conversations with that, because that's where everyone is focused. So how do you how do you see this perceived downside, and what are things both funders and social entrepreneurs should consider in the context of that?
Yeah, so we'd say a couple things. One is that there has to be a vibrant, there's different paths for funding nonprofits, which includes early stage or angel or growth capital or different modes of funding. That's not simply every gift has to be over $10 million or something along those lines. Right. The other kinds of capital just have to exist, and there are funders who exclusively focus in that way. Probably not enough, and they probably need more support in that context. So I think we're focused on a very particular part of the capital structure, for lack of a better word, which is how do you take those ideas that have the potential to receive a big bet and then have that corresponding acceleration or forking in their scale journey or impact journey, which for sure also does not exist as much as it should, and how do we amplify that? The other thing like that said, and one of the reasons why the big bet frame was so meaningful to us is if you think about that, back to the graph about the aspiration gap and the delta between how much dollars are going towards non-social change causes and social change causes, the only way to let's say rebalance that curve is through much bigger check sizes. That ultimately, smaller check sizes, that it's just not going to rebalance that 80-20, that 80-20. Right. So I think this is where William was talking about before, which is for Bridgespin, we care both about magnitude, about flow, and distributional equity. And we're trying to work both of those problems simultaneously and recognize the difficulty in doing that. Yeah. But big bets in some ways help you move that 80-20 curve more quickly.
Right. The other thing I just add there is, I don't want to belittle the problem. I mean, if you have a institutional donor that has a certain amount of money and they strategic shift to focus in one area, it's going to come at the cost of other areas. That's for sure. But when we think about individual donors who are the future, creators of institutional foundations, one of the sort of not surprising elements of sort of just the human dynamic is when there is ambiguity about what can be achieved, the point of arrival, and when there's ambiguity about the pathway, what kind of money it takes to get there, donors don't have in their mind what donors are not being presented with something that says, look, for $10 million, you can get this kind of change in our city, but for $5 million, you can't, right? So when there's strategic ambiguity, you don't have that kind of clarity about what buys what. And what donors therefore then go to, and I've worked inside foundations and we've obviously worked, on a client basis with many, is they will simply say, where does this gift stack up in size relative, I like the organization, I like the leadership, I want to do something for them. Where does this gift stack up in terms of gifts I've given, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want it to be my biggest, like in the 10s, 20s seems fine. And then they'll say, where does my gift stack up in terms of gifts the nonprofit has received? Like, I don't want to all of a sudden be their biggest donor. I'm happy to be a significant one, but not their biggest. And so you have these relative comparisons of giving size that have no bearing on the actual underlying problem. But the more big bets people make and the more big bets nonprofits receive, the more that whole comparison set moves up, right? So when donors have never given a $5 million gift, it's hugely difficult to do it. When they've given 10, it's easier to give the next one. And so we want to have that sort of self-reinforcing cycle of moving up the norms of what's big.
That's a great point. There's a question we have, and again, encourage folks who are out in the audience to ask your questions, and we'll try and figure out how to get them answered or asked at least. The one is the focus of this question is making authentic work with parents big bettable. how can we take this wonderful info you're sharing and make it applicable to the challenges of lifting up a cause that is so often overlooked in conventional philanthropy? And I guess I see this question as one are we casting the problem well enough? And I think you've cautioned us that we probably do a darn good job on that. I don't know. I think we wonder a little bit about the amount of investment that's in the years where the high has ostensibly, if you believe James Heckman, the highest return on investment. So how do we make this applicable and make that compelling? And maybe you guys aren't early childhood experts, but what do you see in terms of that from your limited dip in the waters of this space?
I'll start briefly and then leave the sort of deeper, more thoughtful insights to my colleague. But I mean, I would just essentially echo what you said, Steve, which is I actually think that I would ask each of the folks on the line or on the webinar to think about this point of arrival and credible pathway, because the solution doesn't lie in the problem, right? The solution doesn't lie in saying, gosh, parents are even more important than you realize. The thing that we find is absolutely the typical nonprofit behavior is the more money you want and the more consequential it is to you and the bigger the stakes, the more it is to emphasize the profound importance of the issue. Like, no, I know parents are important, but here's why they're absolutely the most important. And it is almost impossible for an individual nonprofit to raise the profile of an issue relative to other pressing issues in a donor's mind. I mean, just think about it. Like, how important is parenting relative to global warming? How important is parenting relative to gun violence? I mean, it's a psychic disconnect to ask a donor to say, no, I used to think these 10 things were problems. Now I think this one is much more important than the other. Typically doesn't happen. And so the answer isn't how do I elevate this issue? The question is how within this issue can I point to something that is achievable and would be remarkable were it achieved?
Yeah. The only other piece I'd add to it is I would suspect that this would be a problem or a solution where the solution does not exist in any individual organization that's on the phone right now, but it's one that's instead more field forward facing, or where there's a coalition of organizations that are required. And I do think that oftentimes when things get messy in that context, when you think about how do you set the agenda for a field, how do you think about the point of arrival, a credible path for a field, that's, I think we're awfully good at saying we're all working on this common set of problems. I think what becomes more challenging is saying, here's the point of arrival that all of us are in concert working towards. Here's the different slices that we have of that issue. How do we go to the early childhood funding community, let's say, and say, this is how we think this all splits up. This is how all of these organizations interplay. Give us a big bet to catalyze us as a field to elevate the thought of, two-generation frameworks, or how you think about parents within context.
That's a great point, because it ties in one of the things that, and I'll let you add your thoughts on that, William, but that whole idea of consolidating and stuff, I came from a different industry more than 6 years ago, kind of the aerospace place that I was doing something completely different, well-funded and didn't have the same issues that early childhood is. When you walk into this, and I still see it today, is the fragmentation is profound. You have a lot of fledgling organizations, very doing boutique sort of things that vary across communities, across states, counties, and so forth, many financially strapped. And so you end up having this tremendous fragmentation and this sort of consolidation. If you're really trying to move the needle, you need to harness the power of those folks. And there hasn't been any evidence in my view so far that there's a lot of that. So are there evidences or cases where funders have actually come to, at least in the high net worth, where they've actually recognized this and said, no, we need to get these folks together and really consolidate in order to make the enduring change we'd like to see. I could see institutions doing that, like there's the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative that ostensibly operates in a bit of that way, and there are certain other ones that have emerged, Blue Meridian being one. But what do you see out there of at least in the high net worth individuals sort of looking at this landscape and saying, hey, I can't just fund one of these folks. These three folks need to work together. Let's make this happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about sort of the challenge and the opportunity. The challenge, of course, is that for many ultra high net worth individuals, they don't actually have the staff to manage, to be the puppet master of a 50 grant complicated game. And frankly, as nonprofit leaders, I don't know that we want them to be the puppet masters, right?
Right.
So if you sit there and say that actually what unleashes bigger bets is a place to write a check, and it can't be 50 on a given issue. It's got, I mean, it doesn't have to be one, but it has to be a limited number. There's a challenge. The opportunity, of course, is for the kinds of nonprofit organizations that we consider, that we've often called in our own research field catalysts, right? There are players whose very purpose is to amplify and coordinate across. And if those players can paint a compelling picture of what a field can look like tomorrow, that's dramatically better than what it looked like yesterday, and the value of that, it has the potential to attract gifts. I mean, in both the marriage equality movement and in the civil rights struggle in the 50s and the 60s, while there were many, thousands of grassroots organizations involved, there were a handful, 4 to 6 critical intermediaries that received the biggest sets of gifts from philanthropy that were vital in that work. And I think that's also true in, and I think that could also be true in parenting and early childhood as well.
Great. There's another question that came in from Carrie Myers, and she was wanting to know some examples of organizations that are receiving a majority of big funding investments. And I guess there's something implied there that organizations that are receiving a lot of these, maybe you should clarify that. Do you have examples of folks receiving multiple big bets, or is it one of those things that you get one big bet and that's about it? What's some examples of those that have received multiple big bets that you know of?
Yeah. So first of all, there are many organizations. There are many organizations that have received multiple big bets. It's not a one and done.
Okay.
And we tend to think that actually either they build on one another, right? That the kind of strategic clarity needed to get the first stays in place as you look towards second and thirds, and it creates opportunities. I mean, I would point people to our the SSIR issue on Big Bettable that has, we literally publish lists.
Yeah, it's great, and it's an exhaustive list there. So for folks in the audience, it's available online. I think it might have been linked in the promo to this, but the Stanford Social Innovation Review has a special issue about becoming Big Bettable, and it's a great table, and you can get an idea of where those are made and who's making them and who's receiving them. And
some are large, well-established names, but there are also plenty that are actually small organizations that that rise quickly on the back of big bets. So it's all types. There's hundreds and hundreds. So.
Great. And then I guess that's there's a link in this chat box that Sarah just posted for that publication. So for those in the audience want to see it, go to the chat box. You should be able to find it. Great.
And it's just also worth pointing out that there really are many types of big bets. This notion of what will change and be enduring. I'll just make one of the places where big bets have been made, but far too few versus their full potential, is actually in endowments, right? If we think about a chapter, the next chapter, a pre-post, there are many organizations that are doing vital work that will likely need to continue doing that vital work for decades and decades to come. And their work is undermined by financial fragility, by always trying to need to close the budget gap each year. And
those are particularly true at human service organizations.
And particularly true.
Yes.
It's particularly true of community-based and individual human service organizations. And in fact, many of the times the frustration that the donors have with them is that they seem too fragile. And an endowment or a dedicated fund can completely reverse that. The pre-post is actually enormously easy to see, go from fragility to strength, to go from questions each year about what can be done to permanent action. And for gifts to universities and hospitals and cultural institutions, it's actually the norm to give those kinds of gifts. But they're less than 5% of big bets, they're fewer than 5% of big bets to social change organizations. And that's a place where you don't have to ask who's ready to absorb some big dollar amount. If you take that big dollar amount and multiply it by 5%, many organizations can absorb it. So it doesn't just have to be, we solve the entirety of some problem. There's other kind of changes that are very tangible.
No, but that does relate back to some of the mindset challenges around big bets. I do think that we've certainly experienced donors who are less amenable to endowment-like gifts within a social change context, and I think that's part of the challenge that we have in this sector. But also, you asked what are we doing on sort of both sides of the equation. I do think part of our work around the donor education piece is noting the different kinds of theses that can be quite high impact in nature.
Great. Yeah, wonderful. I think I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. I guess we just posted our short survey poll, and we'd love to, before you get off and wrap the webinar, we'd certainly want to look at these questions on the poll that just popped up. So if you could fill that out, those that are with us. I will say that this is, I think, a very interesting topic. I think it's probably just start of a conversation from how the campaign's viewing this. There's the summer in July, the GLR week will probably have further to say about this and maybe opportunity to dig into this. But I think this is a rich topic. And I think we in this space that are trying to make, from a third grade reading proficiency and child outcomes, life outcomes perspective, focusing on the earliest years, I think we have a lot to learn as we, tap into this opportunity to be able to really expand and scale effective things that are going to make a difference. I think, William, I think one of the things in your TED Talk, you talk about the transference of wealth that's going to be happening over the next couple of decades is profound and large and so significant. I think there are things that we can, if we shape the messaging correctly and in the three middle points of the 5 elements that William and Sridhar shared with us, I think we'll be more effective in both our own roadmap for our organization, but also having an opportunity for achieving enduring change. So I'm going to turn this over to, and also everyone shared with GLR 2020 registration, so just do that. And Sarah, I don't know what else you want me to cover here.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I actually did not mean to cut the conversation short. We could continue taking folks' questions and responding to them, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone saw that the poll was posted, and you can respond to the poll while continuing the conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah. So again, use the Q&A box if you have questions out there for our panelists, and glad to share them. I think there was a question about big bets related to family engagement. I'm not sure I've seen those in that list. Maybe William or Sridhar know about those. I do know that certainly Blue Meridian has made big bets in there and focused on certain organizations that's part of their charter.
Yeah, and so it depends how you define family engagement. There are many organizations where family engagement is the secret sauce, right? It's the key to it. The outcomes they've achieved that have received big bets. You mentioned youth villages, which I had shared as an anecdote, and there are of course others. I mean, I actually think the key, again, it's this balance of issue area versus point of arrival, right? I think Sridhar and I both have every bit of confidence that the zone of family engagement, parenting, improving children's lives through the role of parent is not only viable, but is understandable as a topic. The question is, what are not, the question isn't whether the issue area or the topic resonates. It's, it's what are the specific things that an organization or a handful of organizations can do in that topic with that approach that move the needle. But thinking about, Nurse Family Partnership, Harlem Children's Zone, a variety of organizations have that kind of engagement at the heart of what they do. And I would say, you referenced the Heckman work. For sure, that has raised the profile amongst donors and created an openness to this whole area of work.
Right. Great. I think those are let's see if we have any other questions coming in. I think this whole audaciousness aspect of sort of boiling the ocean is one that I think we could maybe emphasize to folks. I think people maybe what moving the needle is, and this whole comprehensiveness of that. As in my opening remarks, I talked a little bit about achievable goals may be more attractive, and I don't know what you're seeing in terms of, I think people have this perception that if I don't materially change child outcomes with this one swing, that it's not fundable. Whereas you may be far more effective. Maybe comment a little bit about that. If you have a bite-sized nugget, someone may feel like this is important, it's endurable, and it's something that's achievable. I suppose that can't be emphasized enough. And are there an example or two beyond the one you already cited that stands out for you guys as to when someone made that shift? I suppose someone that maybe you have supported as a philanthropic entity that made that shift, where they were trying to solve too big of a problem, and when they bite-sized it, it was actually more effective in garnering a big bet.
I'm not sure I'd define it as too big of a problem. I'd say that both are essential, which is that, in some ways, the first step for a donor is their heart being captured, and the visions that we can paint of a different and a better world. And William and I had the fortune to meet with a global entrepreneur whose vision is to, I always forget what Fred's target is in Africa, but it's something like, I think it's to educate 10 million new leaders in Africa by 2030, I believe, with effectively a university credential, something like that. The idea of audacity isn't something I think we would steer away from. It's instead saying that vision is essential to capturing someone's imagination, and then saying, in order to do that, here's where I think we need to get to in the next 5 years that will demonstrate whether this vision is reality or not. This is the point of arrival that I think we can get to. And as a result, these are the investments we're going to make. And if we can demonstrate that, that gives us a great deal of confidence that truly audacious vision is within our grasp. So I wouldn't want the message from our to mitigate the ambitions of the sector. Far from it. I think it's much more around how do you think about the guideposts or the way stations on the way to a
right.
And if you think about the chapters of the book kind of analogy that I mentioned earlier, the full arc of the story we're pursuing, the ultimate goals we hope to achieve should be as ambitious and unchanged as ever. But sometimes when we have an ultimate goal, whether it's about climate change or significant outcomes for all children, the sheer size of that can actually be disorienting around what we need to do over the next 5 years. One of the groups we talk about in our articles is a group called Splash that works on clean water in the developing world, and had actually received a big bet at its founding, but then really struggled to attract significant philanthropic support, even though it had many supporters, right? And they had some very unique approaches using technology. They fundamentally said, if McDonald's can get clean water in all of these places, we should be able to get clean water for the poor in cities, and we're able to, at a much lower cost, achieve the offering of clean water. But they were in many countries sort of only a handful of steps towards their goal in each country, and created a new strategy based on megacities, where they said, look, if you look at where the population is and where the deepest needs for this are, it's megacities, and that will only be more true with each passing decade. And therefore, we're going to demonstrate that in 2 megacities we can get full coverage, which is actually millions and millions of people. So it's not a small number, but it was massively less difficult to achieve than some of their prior goals. Yeah. And with that strategic orientation, attracted big bets, because it seemed it's not like they were fighting, tilting at windmills. They were going to do something important that could get done.
Great. That's a great grounding and a nice tangible example of how to frame it differently and more effectively. I think Sarah, I think we're probably time to turn it over to you, and I want to thank William and Sridhar for sharing a great amount of insight, and I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully you have as well. And I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'd love to second what you just said in terms of thanking William and Sridhar, but I'd also like to extend deep appreciation and thanks to you. This has been a wonderful conversation that you have facilitated and guided us all through. I hope that everybody on the webinar with us today was as inspired as I was throughout this conversation. So many ideas were percolating in my mind about new ways to frame these challenges and opportunities and really tell the story to attract some big bet funding that can help us move the needle in this work. I'd also like to thank all of you who joined in the conversation with us today, shared your insights, shared your thought-provoking questions with our presenters. I hope you'll continue to join in for more of these GLR Learning Tuesdays conversations in the future. And some of them you can see on the screen right here. I'd also like to point out we've got a non-GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar that we would love to share with you. That's being hosted by Lena, and it's tomorrow, focused on family resiliency and early language, leveraging a public health lens with interactive talk initiatives. And I'll be posting a link to the registration for that webinar in just one moment, so you'll see that in the chat box. But just want to thank you all for joining in again today, and hope you'll continue to join us for more of these conversations in the future. But we're still around for another minute or two if you'd like to share your thoughts and feedback on these conversations in the poll that's still on your screen. And here is the link to register for that webinar. Thank you all again so much, and hope to see you for future GLR Learning Tuesdays conversations. Have a great rest of your day.